Wanted to just share another installment of my journey into Anglicanism and away from the Protestant movement. And this video is probably going to be a shorter one, and it's going to just examine real quickly the richness of the liturgical calendar, or the church calendar, as it is also called. Many traditions around the world follow what's called the church calendar, which in Protestantism, pretty much the only thing we observe is Christmas, Easter, maybe Good Friday, maybe Palm Sunday, but that's about it, and we ignore the rest of the church calendar. But in the church calendar, there's a richness, and as we observe the church calendar, we fall into a natural rhythm. And I believe there is a precedence for this in the Jewish holidays. We see that God ordained holidays and feast days within the Hebrew faith so that the ancient Hebrews would be reminded of key elements of his character and of their faith. And we've seen a rediscovery for the Hebrew and Jewish holidays within a lot of the charismatic and Pentecostal streams, but we have not seen a resurgence of the church calendar. In the Catholic traditions, we observe the church calendar extensively. And, you know, for instance, in the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, it's the Advent season. It's a time of almost mourning as we look forward to the Christ child. And in the Advent season, we prepare our own hearts for the coming of Christ. And we go back to that time and we remember the time when the world was without the incarnate Christ. And so we examine our own hearts and ask, are we ready for the coming of Christ? As we look back at the first coming and we look forward to the second coming. And then in the season of Lent, leading up to Easter, is another time of preparation and fasting. And that mirrors, you know, Christ's time in the desert. So there's all of those things. One of the values of the church calendar is it forces us to fall into a natural rhythm. And also, it forces us to remember these things and go through these seasons of self-reflection and these seasons of self-denial and preparation, which is so important. It also forces the preachers of the word to preach on certain topics. For instance, this past Sunday was Trinity Sunday. When was the last time your pastor preached a sermon on the Trinity? I know if I was a pastor of a church, I would try to avoid that. It's a hard sermon. It's not an easy sermon. And even if you follow more of an expository preaching style where you preach through one book of the Bible at a time, like many of the traditions I grew up under, you can avoid ever preaching a sermon on the Trinity because the Trinity doesn't really come out too much in Scripture explicitly. So on Trinity Sunday, it forces you to preach on the Trinity. And that's just one example of why I believe we as Christians can so deepen our faith if we simply return to observing the church calendar. And I think we need an understanding of this. You know, for instance, I received a lot of criticism this past year when I went to an Ash Wednesday service by my Christian brothers because they saw it as a Catholic enterprise, and Catholic in many parts of Christendom, it kind of has a bad word. It's used, especially in the Reformed tradition, unfortunately, there's a huge anti-Catholic sentiment. And, you know, and it's like, well, you know, and it made me really look at it. I'm like, no, this isn't a Catholic tradition. This is a Christian tradition. The marking of the beginning of Lent, when we take the sign of the cross and ashes on our foreheads, and we publicly identify ourselves with Christ. Maybe we need more of this public identification. And I think one way that we can identify ourselves as Christians is when we follow the natural rhythms of the church.